Luke in the 13th chapter. Please stand as you are able for the reading of the gospel. Now he was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, but not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound by 18 years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things he was doing. The wisdom of God. Early this month in the news in a place called Hondo, Texas, there was an event planned by the Friends of the NRA, and the big part of the event was that they were going to raffle off an AR-15. The problem is that Hondo is only 20 miles from Uvalde, Texas. The people in Uvalde complained and they canceled the event. What I learned in that is there's a lack of understanding, not just about guns, but about the human heart. Perhaps the leaders of the city of Hondo were reflecting of the event. They say, "Hey, that's last May it happened. It's been a long time. That's old news. The news today is inflation. We don't need to talk about guns anymore." The cycle of news moves very quickly, but trauma does not. We learned lots about trauma in the First World War, more during the Vietnam War, and even more in Afghanistan and Iraq. Trauma is increasingly become recognized as a clinical condition. This is from the National Institute of Health. Trauma can change your brains on many different levels, from the way you make decisions down to your immediate subconscious responses to the world around you. Part of the reason it can be so hard to overcome the effects of trauma is that it goes after several areas of your brain at once. Trauma mainly affects the 3 most important parts of your brain. I think this is pronounced amygdala. Does anybody know that? Which is your emotional and instinctual center. The hippocampus, which controls memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for regulating your emotions and impulses. All 3 parts work together to manage stress. When you're reminded of a traumatic experience, your amygdala, emotional survival center, goes into overdrive, acting just as it would if you were experiencing that trauma for the first time. Your prefrontal cortex is also suppressed, so you're less capable of controlling your fear. You're stuck in a purely reactive state. Meanwhile, trauma also leads to reduced activity in the hippocampus, which one of whose functions is to distinguish from the past and the present. In other words, your brain can't tell the difference between the actual trauma event and the memory of it. It perceives things that trigger memories of traumatic events as threats themselves. In other words, you may come across a car accident and the ambulance is the same company, same color as the one that took your loved one to the hospital, and you will experience the event of your loved one all over again. One becomes metaphorically crippled, unable to live sustainably, no less than if a person was without their legs. The text for this Sunday is about the crippled woman. It's not about the crippled woman, because naming that makes it seem like it's about her legs. It's about the person who had the spirit of a crippled woman, causing her to stoop. They would not have understood trauma, but they would have understood the relationship between the mind, the heart, and the body. In our day, I think we can imagine the crippled woman as one who had experienced trauma. Actually, I think the metaphor could apply to all chronic illnesses. 18 years is a long time. That's chronic. We always want people to get well. One of the good things about being optimists is we do look for good responses and encouraging people. Of course, we want people to get well. Many times they don't. Our culture is one that values production and growth always increasing, always trying to have more. And there are good things about this. I mean, look at medicine. You know, if I didn't have the surgeries I had, I'd be dead. There's wonderful things about how we look into the world to be creating new things. I have experienced trauma too. It's hidden most of the time. My legs have difficulty, and you can see it, but there's no fix to what I've experienced. There is no closure. Read a book recently, a woman named Pauline Boss, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in a Time of Pandemic and Change. Closure has been one of the biggest words in psychology for some time. It means you have the experience of resolving something, having it be over, like you kind of fix it. That was great. Oops. Okay, where was I? Closure. But there isn't closure to many things, and things are chronic. One thing I liked about the woman in the story is she was very brave. Ooh, look at that. She was very brave. She was in a synagogue on the Sabbath. She walked in by herself to a place that was restricted to men. And the first level of meaning you hear very clearly. It was a debate over the Sabbath. He shouldn't have healed on the Sabbath. But there are other meanings that emerge. She was crippled and ostracized. She was a woman. Of course, we know that Luke emphasizes women. She was forgotten and needed to be remembered and returned to the community, which is exactly what people who are chronically ill need. She was brave for herself. She was also resistant to a system that regularly disregarded the lame and the lost. There are many who have crippled spirits in our world today. Most of it goes unseen and unknown, and it's increasing because of the events we are all experiencing. In May, you know, I got COVID, right? I got the test positive on a Saturday. So I ended up preaching from home, reading the sermon. You remember all of that. But it wasn't just COVID that I got. The Monday prior to when I got COVID is when Uvalde, Texas occurred. When I watched that, I got traumatized. Seeing 21 people murdered, imagining children shot to the point where they could not be identified, seeing parents crumbled on the ground. I empathize with that very deeply. What do we do? I think first we need to recognize that trauma and chronic illness are a normal part of people's lives. I've known many lives in my years as being a pastor, and I know so many people who have lived with some kind of trauma that remains unseen. We need to change our language. I think we could get rid of the word closure when we're talking about this sort of thing. There's a pet peeve that I have around the word resilience. You all know the word resilience? To me, it's a more fashionable word for endurance. We don't want to talk about endurance. That's hard, but resilience. And what happens then? You can have some people who are resilient and others who are not. Oh, good. You have the people who succeed and the people who don't. How American. We change language all the time. It's kind of funny. I went to a site that was about shifting words to make it easier on ourselves. And here are some of them. We change afraid to curious. Tired to recharging. We're not sick anymore, we're cleansing. We're not anxious, we're eager. We're not criticizing, we're just giving feedback. We're not stressed, we're just maximized. Try that one. We're not greedy, we're just enjoying. And of course, you know, dead ends are no longer alive, there are no outlets. And my favorite is we really don't want speed bumps to sound too scary, so they become traffic calming devices. Watch the language. Even to, I've said this before about the question, how are you? Of course, most of the time it's, how are you? I'm fine, da-da-da-da-da. But if you really ask it, if you really take it in and somebody says, how are you? To a traumatized person, not a good thing. What it says is to the person who's traumatized is, I've still failed. I'm not what I want to be. It's better just to say, I really have been thinking about you. It's really good to see you. I have this rare disagreement with Eugene Peterson's message. You all know the message, right? Translation, it's more like a paraphrase. When he translated this text, he said, there was a woman present, so twisted and bent over with arthritis. Arthritis? Identify the ailment as arthritis. What I heard, it was a spirit of being crippled. I kind of like the New Jerusalem Bible better, where it says, a woman was there who for 18 years had been possessed by a spirit and left her enfeebled. She was bent double and unable to stand straight. Now, as many of you know, I have arthritis. I've had 2 surgeries as a result. I'm not bent forward, but I do have difficulty standing for a long time, and you may have noticed. The other day, somebody said, I kind of watched you bouncing around up there on the platform. I'm kind of worried about you. People don't often see the crippled spirit, and we are all kind of reticent to share our brokenness because we're afraid that we will feel ashamed and feel like we have somehow failed. People who have crippled spirits are also, these days, I think, unwittingly ostracized. Not in the way in the Bible where it's all organized, but then a little less direct, a little more subtle, but ostracized nonetheless. And I will tell you very, very clearly, the greater ailment than the arthritis is the crippled spirit. It's the crippled spirit. The Greek word translated as crippled here doesn't really mean crippled. Can't pronounce this quite, but it's Athanasius or something like that. It's translated in the New Testament at different points as infirmity, sickness, disease, and even disability. The most common translation, however, is weakness. The woman was weak. A spirit of weakness. I kind of like an idea of the language of an enfeebled spirit. I can tell you that if there's anything that can enfeeble you, it is trauma. Especially, I think, for many people now when we have been in a traumatic pandemic for some time. What do? We open our minds sensitive to the needs of the enfeebled. We suspend judgment. We have compassion. We invite them in spite of whatever their experience has been. Not just invite, but embrace them. I further believe that the crippled woman gained wisdom through her experience. Wisdom can be born of trauma and suffering. The traumatized have wisdom that others do not, a wisdom of weakness. And ironically, it's the wisdom of weakness that helped her to go and be so brave as to resist the establishment. The Apostle Paul used the word all the time. I was with you in your weakness. I will not boast except for my weakness. My power is made perfect in weakness. I am content with my weakness, for he was crucified in weakness. The people in Uvalde, as well as other places like Buffalo, still suffer. They see things still on the TV screen. And it's not just those people who lost children who are traumatized. That whole community is traumatized. The whole town, the responders, and then you have to count all the friends and relatives, not necessarily in Uvalde or even in Texas, who have been traumatized because a loved one back in Texas has been killed. I worry about children in our country, not just for the things that you can see where they suffer, but for the hidden things. These children who witness this will have a challenge their whole life. I sometimes wonder if the next generation will, after Generation Z, will be Generation T. Multiple Uvaldes, number of shootings we've had in our country has created a big social problem, and it is also a spiritually crippling problem. In our world, people have crippled, enfeebled spirits because of all they have experienced, and it's growing. First thing we need to do is to recognize them as Jesus did, invite them in, embrace them. They are the least of these in our world. In closing, a couple of words of modern biblical wisdom. First one, life is chronic. It's meant to be lived, not to be fixed. Trauma can also be collective. America has experienced trauma. We can say that America is a victim of trauma right now. In Uvalde, Texas, people are enduring. In Buffalo, elsewhere, people in Ukraine are enduring. The women in Afghanistan are enduring. The people in the Bible were enduring, whether they were resilient or not. Our job is not to fix people, but to love, invite, and embrace traumatized people in the name of Jesus Christ. Not offering our strength and offering them resilience and suggestions and things that they can do, but simply not trying to give them power, but simply be there with them in our own weakness. Because we will touch them, if we touch them in our weakness, there will be communion, and I believe there can be hope. Amen.
Amen.